June 4, 1942. 09:17 hours. 15 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. 6 American Wildcats. 15 Japanese Zeros descending from 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander John Thach checks his instrument panel. Fuel, 68%. Ammunition, 1,800 rounds across 6 50 caliber guns. Altitude, 14,000 feet. Airspeed, 185 knots. The math is simple. The Zero weighs 5,313 pounds empty. The Wildcat weighs 7,500 pounds loaded. The Zero climbs at 3,100 feet per minute. The Wildcat manages 2,300. In a turning fight, the Zero completes a 360-degree circle in 5.6 seconds. The Wildcat needs 7.8 seconds. In a dogfight, the Wildcat is a coffin with wings. Standard Navy doctrine gives these pilots 90 seconds to live. But Thach keys his radio. His voice is calm, almost flat. 4 words that break every rule in the book. Execute the weave. His wingman, Ensign Ram Dib, 23 years old, 127 flight hours, turns left. Toward Thach. Thach turns right. Toward Dib. 2 planes flying directly at each other, closing at a combined 370 knots. Above them, Lieutenant Shigeru Itaya, squadron leader of the Kaga's fighter group, 14 confirmed kills, watches the American maneuver and hesitates. This isn't how Americans fight. Americans scatter. Americans panic. Americans die alone. 90 seconds later, Itaya's wingman is dead. His engine cowling shredded by 50 caliber rounds that came from an impossible angle. By the time the engagement ends, 6 Wildcats are still flying. Multiple Zeros are burning wreckage falling toward the Pacific. And the best pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy are retreating in confusion. The tactic that saved them wasn't developed in a wind tunnel, wasn't approved by the Bureau of Aeronautics, wasn't in any manual the Navy had ever published. It was figured out with matchsticks, on a kitchen table, at 2 in the morning, by a man who refused to accept that his pilots had to die. This is the story of the WWII. How one squadron commander broke doctrine, defied physics, and turned the worst fighter plane in the Pacific into a Zero killer. To understand why John Thach sat at his kitchen table night after night, moving matchsticks like a man possessed, you have to understand the machine he was up against. The Mitsubishi A6M0. Jiro Horikoshi designed it in 1937 with a single obsession: agility over everything. Empty weight, 5,313 pounds. Wingspan, 39 feet, 4 inches. Rate of climb, 3,100 feet per minute. The Zero could go from sea level to 15,000 feet in 4 minutes and 50 seconds. An American pilot checking his instruments would look up to find a Zero already above him. But the climb rate wasn't what killed you. The turn radius killed you. Japanese engineers had stripped the Zero down to its skeleton. No self-sealing fuel tanks, saving 92 pounds. No armor plating behind the pilot's seat, saving 150 pounds. No bulletproof windscreen, saving 46 pounds. Every ounce of protection sacrificed for agility. The result was a fighter that could reverse direction so fast it seemed to violate physics. Turn radius at combat speed, 1,118 feet. The Zero could pivot inside anything the Americans flew. Anything. Now consider the American F-4F Wildcat. Grumman built it like a tank with wings. Loaded weight, 7,500 pounds. Armor plating, 155 pounds protecting the pilot. Self-sealing tanks, 75 pounds of rubberized protection. All the safety features that kept a pilot alive if he took a hit. But physics doesn't negotiate. That extra 2,000 pounds meant a wider turn radius, 1,846 feet versus the Zero's 1,118. A slower climb, 2,300 feet per minute versus 3,100. In a one-on-one dogfight, the kind American pilots were trained for, the Wildcat couldn't stay with the Zero, not even close. The numbers told the story before any gun was fired. If a Zero latched onto your tail, you had two options. Turn with him and watch him tighten inside your radius until his 20mm cannons lined up. Or run and watch him close the distance because he was faster in a climb. Either way, you were dead. You just got to choose how long it took. Early 1942, the Pacific Theater. American pilots were dying at a ratio that the Navy didn't like to discuss in public. The numbers were brutal. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American pilots claimed 18 Zero kills. Japanese records confirmed 3 actual losses. At the same battle, Japanese pilots killed 69 Americans. The kill ratio was 23-1. Entire squadrons gutted in weeks. VF-42 lost 8 pilots in their first 3 engagements. VF-3 lost 11. Veterans with hundreds of flight hours, gone. Replacements with 50 hours, gone faster. The men who survived described the same thing. You'd be in formation. You'd see the Zeros coming down from altitude, that distinctive silhouette, the red circles on the wings. And then, it was chaos. Planes scattering, radios screaming, tracers everywhere. The last thing most pilots saw was the same image. A Zero filling their rearview mirror, the canopy glinting in the Pacific sun, the muzzle flashes from its wing-mounted cannons. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Leonard, one of the few survivors of VF-42's first engagement, wrote in his after-action report, "The Zero turned inside me like I was standing still. I pulled 5 Gs trying to stay with him. It wasn't enough. He was inside my turn before I completed 90 degrees. I only survived because his wingman distracted him." The men who made it back to the carrier had a look. That hollow stare of someone who knows he survived by luck, not skill. Who knows that tomorrow the luck runs out. Ready rooms that held 20 pilots started holding 12, then 8. The empty chairs weren't discussed. The photographs came down. The new guys showed up, younger every month. And the veterans didn't bother learning their names. What was the point? They'd be dead by Thursday. This was the reality of American air power in the Pacific. The planes were inferior. The pilots knew it. And the men in charge, the admirals, the doctrine writers, the bureaucrats in Washington, had exactly one solution: train harder, fly more aggressively, fight like men. Which raises a question. If the problem was physics, if the Zero was simply a better dogfighter, why did the brass keep insisting that courage could close the gap? Because admitting the truth would mean admitting that the doctrine was wrong. And doctrine, in the United States Navy, was written by men who had never faced a Zero, men who learned to fly in the 1920s. Men who believed that air combat was still about individual bravery, one plane against another, like knights jousting in the sky. The ghost of the Red Baron was still flying. And American pilots were dying because of it. The doctrine that was killing American pilots had a name. It was called Flash Fighting One-on-One, and it was built on a ghost. 1918. The skies over France. Men in open cockpits, scarves trailing in the wind, dueling with machine guns at 100 miles an hour. The Red Baron. Eddie Rickenbacker, Billy Bishop, the Ace, the Lone Wolf, the Hero. That was the image burned into every flight manual, every training syllabus, every promotion board in the United States Navy. Air combat was a test of individual skill. One pilot against another. The better man wins. It made for great recruiting posters. It made for terrible tactics. By 1942, the men writing American fighter doctrine were admirals and senior officers who had learned to fly in biplanes, fabric wings, rotary engines, top speed of maybe 120 knots. In that world, one-on-one combat made sense. The planes were evenly matched. The pilot was the variable. But these men had never seen a zero. They'd read reports. They'd seen the intelligence summaries. Commander Henri Olsen, intelligence officer for Pacific Fleet Air, had submitted a detailed analysis in January 1942. The Mitsubishi Zero represents a decisive advantage in maneuverability. Recommend immediate revision of tactical doctrine to emphasize mutual support over individual engagement. The report was filed. No revisions were made. The admirals believed that American pilots, properly trained, properly aggressive, could overcome any technical disadvantage. Willpower, fighting spirit, the American way. Admiral John Thach, chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, wrote in February 1942, "The fighting qualities of our pilots will prevail over any material advantage enjoyed by the enemy. Aggressive action remains the cornerstone of aerial victory, so the training manuals stayed the same. Engage the enemy. Press the attack. Fight one-on-one until someone dies." The pilots followed orders, and they died. Here's what makes it worse. The evidence was everywhere. After-action reports piled up on desks in Washington. Pilots who survived, the lucky few, wrote detailed accounts of what happened up there. The Zero's turning radius. The impossibility of staying with it. The way Japanese pilots would bait you into a turn, then reverse and shred you. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, commanding VF-42, wrote in his March 1942 report, "Current doctrine is inadequate against this aircraft. Pilots who attempt turning engagements die. We need new tactics or better aircraft, preferably both, urgently." The data was clear. The doctrine was failing. Nothing changed. Because changing doctrine meant admitting the doctrine was wrong. And the men who wrote the doctrine were the same men who sat on promotion boards, the same men who approved budgets, the same men who would have to explain to Congress why American pilots were dying at 6-1 against an enemy they dismissed as inferior. It was easier to blame the pilots. They needed more training, more aggression, more fighting spirit. The Bureau of Aeronautics knew the Wildcat was outclassed. Engineers at Grumman were working on the next generation, the F-6F Hellcat, 2,000 horsepower, climbing at 3,500 feet per minute. Engineers at Vought were building the F-4U Corsair, planes that could actually compete with the Zero. But those planes were 2 years away, maybe 3. In the meantime, the official guidance was simple: do your best with what you have. Translated from bureaucrat to English, die slower if you can. This was the betrayal, not enemy action, not bad luck. A system that refused to adapt. Officers who valued their careers over their pilots' lives. A doctrine written by men who would never have to fly against the enemy. It was designed to fight. The pilots knew. They talked about it in the ready rooms, in the bunks, in the quiet hours before a mission. They knew the brass had failed them. They knew the planes were wrong for the fight. They knew that every time they climbed into a Wildcat, they were betting their lives on a doctrine that didn't work. And they climbed in anyway, because that's what the job was. But one of them, a squadron commander with VF-3, the Felix the Cat Squadron, a man named John Thach, climbed into his Wildcat with something else. A suspicion, a half-formed idea. If the plane couldn't change, maybe the fight could. He just needed to prove it. And to do that, he needed a laboratory. He found one, in his kitchen, with a box of matchsticks. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thach wasn't the type to give speeches about bravery. Born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, April 19, 1905. Naval Academy class of 1927. Flight training at Pensacola, 1929. By 1942, he had 12 years in cockpits and a reputation as one of the best pilots in the Navy. But what set Thach apart wasn't his flying. It was his thinking. He was a systems thinker. A man who looked at a problem the way an engineer looks at a broken machine. Not with frustration, but with curiosity. What's failing? Why, what can be changed? He understood the Wildcat's limitations better than anyone in Washington because he flew the thing every day. He felt the sluggish turn in his hands. He watched the altimeter lag when he pulled into a climb. He knew the exact moment when a pursuing Zero would gain angle. And he knew there was nothing he could do about it in a one-on-one fight. He also understood something else. The Navy wasn't going to give him a better plane. Not this year. Maybe not next year. The Hellcat was a blueprint and a promise. His pilots needed a solution they could use tomorrow. So Thach did something unusual. He stopped thinking about the plane. And he started thinking about geometry. The Zero's advantage was the turn. Every American pilot knew it. You get into a turning fight with a Zero, you lose. The Japanese pilot pulls tighter, gains angle, and puts his guns on your tail. Basic physics. Unchangeable. But Thach saw something in that physics that others had missed. The Zero's tight turn wasn't just an advantage. It was a commitment. Once a Zero pilot started his turn, he was locked into that radius. He couldn't widen out without losing the angle he'd worked for. The tighter he turned, the more predictable his path became. What if you could use that predictability against him? Night after night, Thach sat at his kitchen table in Coronado, California. His wife, Madeline, would go to bed. The house would go quiet. And he'd pull out a box of wooden matchsticks. Each matchstick was a plane. He'd lay them on the table, moving them through imaginary engagements. Here's a Wildcat. Here's a Zero on his tail. The Zero is turning inside. 2 seconds from gun solution. Now, what if there's a second Wildcat? He positioned another matchstick parallel to the first. 2 Wildcats, flying side by side, maybe 200 yards apart. The Zero is on the tail of the right-hand Wildcat. Standard doctrine says that Wildcat should turn away, try to shake the Zero, extend the fight, hope for a lucky break. Thach moved the matchstick differently. The right-hand Wildcat turns left, toward his wingman. At the same time, the left-hand Wildcat turns right, toward his partner. The 2 Wildcats are now flying at each other. And the Zero, still turning, still committed to that tight radius, still fixated on the tail of his target, suddenly finds himself crossing directly in front of the second Wildcat's guns. Thach stared at the matchsticks. He moved them again and again. Different angles, different entry points, different closing speeds. Every time, the same result. The Zero's tight turn kept him in the kill zone longer. His own advantage became a trap. The geometry was inescapable. Thach calculated the math. At a closing rate of 250 knots, the Zero would be exposed to the crossing Wildcats' guns for approximately 2.1 seconds. A Wildcat's 650 caliber machine guns fired 800 rounds per minute combined. In 2.1 seconds, a pilot could put 28 rounds into the crossing area. The Zero had no armor. 150 caliber round to the engine, 1 round to the fuel tank, 1 round to the pilot. Any of them would be fatal. Thach called it the beam defense position. The pilots would call it the Thach weave. The mechanics were deceptively simple. 2 fighters fly parallel, close enough to support each other, 200 to 300 yards, far enough to maneuver. When a bandit latches onto one, both pilots turn toward each other. Hard, immediate, no hesitation. The attacked pilot is turning into the enemy, which feels suicidal. But his wingman is also turning, and his nose is coming around to meet the attacker head-on. The Zero pilot, focused on his kill, doesn't see it coming. He's locked onto the tail in front of him. Tunnel vision. The primal focus of a predator about to strike. By the time he notices the second Wildcat, he's already flying into a stream of 50 caliber rounds. If he tries to break off, he has to widen his turn, which means the original target escapes. If he stays committed, he dies. The weave created a choice with no good options. But there was a catch, a big one. The Thach weave only worked if both pilots trusted each other completely. You had to turn toward your wingman and believe, truly believe, that he was turning toward you. If he froze, if he hesitated, if he broke the wrong direction, you both died. There was no room for ego, no room for the lone wolf mentality that the Navy had been breeding for 20 years. You weren't fighting as an individual. You were fighting as a unit. A single organism with 2 cockpits. And there was a skill requirement that most American pilots had never practiced. Deflection shooting. Hitting a target that's crossing your nose at 300 miles an hour, not flying straight at you or straight away. It required instinct, practice, a feel for lead and timing that couldn't be taught in a classroom. Thach drilled his pilots relentlessly. Ensign Edward Bassett, Ensign Ram Dibb, Lieutenant Tom Cheek, Lieutenant Junior Grade Daniel Gay. They practiced the weave until it became muscle memory. Turn into your partner. Trust the geometry. Take the shot. Captain James Murray, observing one of Thach's training sessions, called the tactic theoretical nonsense. He told Thach that no pilot would willingly fly toward a collision with his wingman. Thach's response was simple. Then they'll die, and the ones who learn will live. He knew his pilots could learn it. He knew they could suppress the ego, trust the wingman, fly the geometry. He just needed to prove it worked outside a kitchen. He was about to get his chance, because the Japanese fleet was sailing toward a small atoll in the Central Pacific, a place called Midway, June 4, 1942, 0900 hours, somewhere northeast of Midway Atoll. John Thach is strapped into the cockpit of his Wildcat, cruising at 14,000 feet. Engine temperature, nominal. Fuel, 74%. Airspeed, 162 knots. Below him, spread out in a ragged formation, are 15 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 3, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Lem Massey. Slow, unarmored. Maximum speed, 130 knots. Each one carrying a single Mark 13 torpedo slung beneath its belly, weighing 2,216 pounds. The Devastators are bait. Everyone knows it. Their job is to fly low and slow toward the Japanese carriers, drop their torpedoes, and hope the enemy's combat air patrol is looking somewhere else. The enemy's combat air patrol is not looking somewhere else. Thach counts them as they descend from high altitude. 15 zeros, maybe 20. Dark silhouettes against the Pacific blue, dropping toward his formation like a handful of thrown knives. Speed, approximately 280 knots. Altitude, decreasing. Closing time, 90 seconds. He has 6 Wildcats. 6 against 20. Standard doctrine is clear. When outnumbered, American fighters should engage individually, draw the enemy away from the bombers, buy time with aggression and sacrifice. Fight like men, die like men. Thach has a different idea. The Zeros hit the Devastators first. The torpedo bombers are flying at barely 150 knots, slow enough that a Zero can make multiple passes without breaking a sweat. Thach watches from above as the slaughter begins. A Devastator bursts into flame. Pilot, Ensign Wesley Osmus, 24 years old. Then another. Pilot, Machinist, Harry Coral. The formation starts to dissolve. Pilots trying to hold course. Pilots trying to jink. Pilots dying. Lieutenant Commander Massey's Devastator sees hits. Smoke pours from his engine. He holds course anyway, trying to reach torpedo release range. He never makes it. His plane cartwheels into the Pacific at 9:14 hours. The Zeros are everywhere now. That's the thing about them. They're so fast, so agile, that a handful can seem like a swarm. They flash through the American formation, guns blazing, then pull up and around for another pass. The air is filled with tracers. The radio is filled with screaming. Then they notice the Wildcats. 3 Zeros peel off from the massacre below and climb toward Thach's flight. He watches them come, watches the angle, watches the distance close. 1,200 yards, 1,000 yards, 800 yards. This is the moment. Everything he worked out on that kitchen table, everything he drilled into his pilots during weeks of practice, it either works now or it doesn't. Thach keys his radio. His voice is calm, almost flat. Execute the weave. His wingman, Ensign Ram Dib, is 200 yards to his right. Dib has 127 hours in a Wildcat. He's 23 years old. 6 weeks ago, he was practicing carrier landings in San Diego. Now he's about to bet his life on a tactic drawn with matchsticks. Dib turns left, toward Thach. Thach turns right, toward Dib. The 2 Wildcats are now converging, crossing paths, each one's nose sweeping across the sky where the other just was. Closing speed, 370 knots combined. Time to intersection, 1.9 seconds. A Zero has committed to Dib's tail. The pilot is Lieutenant Junior Grade Fujita Iyozo. 340 hours in the Zero, 3 confirmed kills against the Chinese. He's inside Dib's turn, gaining angle, 400 yards, and closing. His gun sight settles on the Wildcat's engine cowling. His finger moves to the trigger. 3 seconds from gun solution. 2 seconds. 1. Fujita never sees Thach. Thach's Wildcat comes around, nose dropping slightly. The horizon tilts 47 degrees. G-forces push blood into his boots, 4.2 Gs on the accelerometer. His vision narrows. The edges go gray. His hands feel heavy on the stick, fingers thick on the trigger. The gun sight drifts across the empty air in front of the Zero's flight path. Deflection shooting. You don't aim at the target. You aim at where the target will be. You fire into empty space and let the enemy fly into your bullets. Thach's thumb finds the gun button. His mouth tastes like copper. He presses the trigger. Time fractures. 650 caliber machine guns roar. 800 rounds per minute, combined. The Wildcat shudders from the recoil. Spent casings pour from the ejection ports, tumbling away in the slipstream. The tracers arc outward in a lazy curve. 2,810 feet per second muzzle velocity, but from Thach's perspective, it feels slower. A stream of orange fire reaching across the sky. The Zero's nose enters the stream. The first round punches through the engine cowling, shattering the oil cooler. The second catches the reduction gear housing. The third, fourth, fifth disappear into the Sake radial engine, 950 horsepower, now becoming scrap metal. Fujita's Zero doesn't explode. It disintegrates. Oil sprays from the shattered engine. The propeller seizes. The nose drops as thrust vanishes. Pieces shear off. Cowling panels, cooling baffles, chunks of aluminum skin. The elegant machine becomes a tumbling wreck in less than 2 seconds. Fujita never touches his stick. He's dead before he knows he's in danger. The Zero drops through the formation, trailing smoke and debris, and hits the Pacific at 9:19 hours. Thach works the bolt of his mind. No, not a bolt. This is semi-automatic. The guns cycle, ready for the next burst. The whole engagement has taken 3.4 seconds. He keys the radio. Splash 1. Dib is still alive. He reverses his turn, scanning for the next threat. His heart is hammering, 160 beats per minute. His flight suit is soaked with sweat. But he's alive. Another Zero is already lining up. Petty Officer 2nd Class Tanaka Seiji, 200 hours, 2 kills. He's seen his wingman die, but commits anyway. The American is turning, presenting his tail. Easy kill. Thach calls it again. Weave. Dib turns toward Thach. Thach turns toward Dib. The geometry repeats. Tanaka realizes his mistake too late. The second Wildcat, Thach, is coming around. The nose is dropping. The guns are tracking. He tries to break off. He widens his turn, pulls up, attempts to climb away. But the Wildcat's 50 calibers have a range of 600 yards. Tanaka is at 380. Thach fires. 1.8 second burst. 24 rounds. Tanaka's Zero shudders as rounds punch through the wing root. The left wing folds upward, shearing off at the spar. The aircraft snaps into an uncontrolled roll and drops toward the ocean. 2 shots. 2 kills. Elapsed time since first engagement, 47 seconds. The Japanese pilots are confused now. This isn't how Americans fight. Americans scatter. Americans panic. Americans turn away and run and die alone. These Americans are doing something else. They're turning toward each other. They're crossing and recrossing, a braided pattern in the sky, and every time a Zero commits to a tail, he finds himself staring into a head-on stream of tracers. Lieutenant Itaya, watching from above, radios to his remaining pilots. Break off the fighters. Focus on the torpedo bombers. But the damage is done. The Zero's perfect coordination has fractured. Some pilots obey, diving back toward the devastators. Others continue attacking the Wildcats, determined to avenge their fallen comrades. The disciplined swarm has become a disorganized melee. Thach's flight keeps weaving, keeps covering each other, keeps forcing the Zeros into impossible choices. At 9:23, Ensign Bassett scores a kill. A zero commits to his tail. Lieutenant Cheek crosses behind and puts a 2-second burst into the enemy's engine. At 9:27, Thach kills his third zero of the morning. This one tried to climb away after his first pass. A mistake. The climb bled his energy. Thach caught him at the top of his arc, airspeed below 120 knots, hanging in the sky like a clay pigeon. The Wildcats take hits. They're not invincible. Dibb's aircraft has 14 holes in the fuselage. Cheek's left aileron is shredded, but the armor holds. The self-sealing tanks do their job, and the pilots stay in the fight. At 9:31, the Zeros break off, not retreating in defeat, called away. American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown have arrived over the Japanese fleet. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are under attack. The Zeros are needed elsewhere. When the sky clears, Thach takes account. His Wildcats are still flying. All 6, shot up, low on ammunition. Thach has 340 rounds remaining from his original 1,800, fuel gauges showing 31%. But flying. The Zeros have lost at least 5 aircraft confirmed, possibly more. The exact count would be debated for decades. Fog of war, but the ratio is inverted. 6 Wildcats against 20 Zeros, and the Wildcats survived. Below, the Devastators have been massacred. Of the 15 aircraft that launched from Yorktown, only 2 survive. Torpedo Squadron 3 ceases to exist as a fighting unit. Lieutenant Commander Massey is dead. The torpedo attack was a tactical failure, not a single hit on the enemy ships. But the sacrifice wasn't meaningless. The Zeros were at sea level, chasing torpedo bombers, when the American dive bombers arrived at 14,000 feet. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was out of position. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers would be burning, and John Thach's Wildcats survived. Outnumbered more than 3-to-1, flying an inferior plane, using a tactic that wasn't in any manual, they survived. More than survived. They proved something. The Zero was not invincible. The geometry could be beaten. The doctrine was wrong, and a man with matchsticks was right. Now the only question was whether anyone would listen. Word spread through the fleet the way word always spreads. Pilot to pilot, ready room to ready room. A tactic that works when nothing else does. Within days, every squadron commander in the Pacific wanted to know what John Thach had figured out. How did his Wildcats survive at Midway? How did 6 planes hold off 20 Zeros and live to tell about it? Thach explained it the same way he'd developed it. Simple geometry, mutual support. Trust your wingman. Suppress the ego. He drew it on chalkboards, walked pilots through the mechanics, watched them practice until the weave became instinct. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, the same officer whose urgent reports had been ignored by Washington, flew to meet Thach personally. After 2 hours of discussion, Flatley wrote in his diary, "Thach has solved the Zero problem, not with a better aircraft, but with better thinking. This will save hundreds of lives." The Navy, to its credit, recognized what it had. The Thach weave became official doctrine within months. Fleet Air Tactical Unit Bulletin 342, issued August 1942. The beam defense position, developed by LCDR John S. Thach, is hereby designated as standard operating procedure for all fighter squadrons engaged against maneuverable enemy aircraft. Not a suggestion, not an optional technique, mandatory. The men who had insisted on individual aggression, on fighting one-on-one, on the cult of the lone ace, they quietly updated the manuals. Admiral Towers, who had written about Flausch's fighting spirit thus prevailing over material disadvantage, never publicly acknowledged the failure of his doctrine. No apologies. No acknowledgement that the old tactics had been killing pilots for a year. The WWII was simply absorbed into the institution, as if it had always been there. That's how bureaucracies work. They don't admit mistakes. They just revise history. The Japanese Navy noticed the change. Captain Minoru Genda, chief architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and senior air staff officer for the combined fleet, wrote in his analysis of post-Midway engagements, American fighter tactics have evolved significantly since early 1942. They no longer engage in individual combat. They operate in coordinated pairs, using crossing maneuvers that negate our turning advantage. Our pilots report difficulty maintaining pursuit when this tactic is employed. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading fighter ace with 64 kills, encountered the Thach WWII for the first time over Guadalcanal in August 1942. His account, published after the war. I committed to an American Wildcat's tail. I was certain of the kill. Then his wingman crossed behind me. I saw tracers passing over my canopy. I had to break off. It happened 3 times in that engagement. Each time I committed to a tail, another American appeared from an impossible angle. They were not fighting as individuals. They were fighting as a machine. Thach kept flying, kept teaching, kept refining. He commanded the escort carrier USS Sicily during the Korean War. He served as commander, Task Force 77, during the Vietnam War. He rose through the ranks, commander, captain, eventually admiral. On his desk, throughout his career, he kept a small box of wooden matchsticks. The WWII outlived even his career. Korea, 1950. American pilots flying F-9F Panthers against MiG-15s over the Yalu River. Different planes, different enemy, same principle. Mutual support, never fight alone. Trust the man on your wing. Vietnam, 1965. F-4 Phantoms tangling with North Vietnamese MiGs. The Thach WWII had evolved by then. They called it the Fluid 4, the fighting wing. Different names for the same geometry. 2 planes working as one. The attacker becomes the target. The Navy's Top Gun School, founded in 1969, built its curriculum on principles Thach had developed in his kitchen. Mutual support, coordinated tactics, the rejection of individual glory in favor of unit effectiveness. Decades after Midway, pilots were still flying patterns that traced back to matchsticks on a wooden table. The Zero, for its part, never recovered. Oh, the plane kept flying, thousands of them, right up to the last day of the war. Japanese factories produced 10,449 A6M0s between 1940 and 1945. But the myth was broken. The Zero was beatable. Not by building a better plane. The Hellcat and Corsair helped, but they didn't arrive until 1943, but by flying smarter. Once American pilots understood that, the kill ratios began to shift. By June 1944, 2 years after Midway, American pilots achieved a 13-to-1 kill ratio against the Zero during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The engagement became known as the Plage Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The hunters had become the hunted. History remembers Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War. The moment the Japanese advance broke. The 4 carriers burning, the tide shifting, the long road to Tokyo beginning. It remembers the dive bombers, the torpedo squadrons, the intelligence coup that put American ships in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. It doesn't remember the kitchen table as well as it should. John Thach never got a medal for the WWII. He got medals for other things, the Navy Cross for Midway, the Legion of Merit for his command of escort carriers, the Distinguished Service Medal for his Vietnam-era leadership. But there's no decoration for solving a problem that your superiors refused to acknowledge existed. No award for being right when the institution was wrong. He didn't seem to mind. That wasn't why he did it. He did it because pilots were dying. Because the system had failed them. Because someone had to sit down and think, really think, about why the old way wasn't working. Admiral Thach retired from the Navy in 1967 after 40 years of service. He died on April 15, 1981, in Coronado, California, the same city where he'd sat at his kitchen table, moving matchsticks, while the Pacific waited. Every Zero pilot at Midway had trained for years. They flew a superior machine. They followed their doctrine perfectly. They had every advantage that mattered on paper. They lost to a man who played with matchsticks. There's a lesson in that. Not about air combat. About systems. About the gap between the people who write the rules and the people who have to live by them. Sometimes the answer isn't more training, isn't more aggression, isn't trying harder at a strategy that doesn't work. Sometimes the answer is a quiet room, a simple tool, and the willingness to ask a question that everyone above you is too proud to consider. What if we're doing this wrong? The WWII is still taught at Annapolis. It's studied at war colleges around the world. It remains one of the most influential tactical innovations in the history of aerial combat. And it was invented by a man who refused to accept that his pilots had to die just because a manual said so. That's the story worth remembering. Not just the tactic. Anyone can learn the geometry. But the mindset behind it. The willingness to question doctrine. The courage to trust your own analysis when everyone above you says you're wrong. John Thach proved that one person, thinking clearly, can change the rules of the game. He did it with matchsticks. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that individual thinking can defeat institutional arrogance, do us a favor. Hit the subscribe button. Turn on notifications. We're telling more stories like this, stories about people who solved impossible problems by refusing to accept the official answer. Every subscription tells us you want more. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone fighting a system. Someone being told to follow rules that don't work. Someone who needs to know that matchsticks on a kitchen table once defeated the best fighter plane in the world. That truth matters. Thank you for watching.